Triple!
Here's a little disclaimer. I have no ill will towards anyone of any ethnicity, nor do I encourage anyone to have ill will towards individuals of any ethnicity. But this video is about getting the historical facts straight and also getting the theological aspects of the video that I am criticizing straight. So let's get right into it. Of course, it's not just hard to tell their color, it's actually impossible because those images are stone cut. But they are referred to as Asiatic. This doesn't mean that their skin color wasn't dark. It simply means that they are not considered Ethiopian or African. There are a number of problems with this short bit of video. First of all, the video maker says, let's look at these Asiatics again in full color. This is the footstool of King Tut. So in other words, he is saying, let's look at the same thing again, but we're actually not looking at the same thing. We're looking at something different. In other words, I don't think this is as far as the masked man fallacy, because he's not actually putting the same thing, but he is labeling them as the same thing, which is, I think, probably even worse than the masked man fallacy, because you're literally saying that two different things are the same. Okay, so the second problem here is that he is assuming that all of Israel, let me rephrase that. All of Egypt's enemies were black, which they certainly weren't. We know that as a fact because not Israel, Egypt. The Egyptians had the Hittites as major enemies at the time, and possibly the Assyrians as well. I'm not really sure on the Assyrians though, but we know for a fact that the Hittites were definitely rivals to the Assyrians, and the Hittites were for a fact not black, at least for the majority of their population. There may have been a black minority there, but that's definitely true. Also, the footstool, as far as I know, doesn't make a claim to have all the enemies of Egypt on there, which again we get to the problem where you're saying one thing and you're just putting it farther than it actually goes. It has some of the enemies of Egypt on there, but not all of them. And on the last picture, yes, I understand. The ancient Israelites definitely were not this white. But of course, there's some population admixture, and that explains why many of today's Israelites are a lot whiter than they are back in the day. And it also happens to be because of the areas where they lived, because it is known that depending on where you live, it affects your skin color. For example, people in really, really sunny countries closer to the equator, they tend to have a more tan skin or a darker skin, while people farther away, closer to the ice caps, tend to be paler in complexion. It's just a natural thing that happens to humans. Of course.
Oh, baby, a triple!
Yes, notice the locks of hair and negroid facial features common in all Middle Eastern people, even those who apparently aren't actually negroid. So maybe you aren't entirely aware of what negroid actually is. I actually did some research on these images, and here's a few things I came up with. First of all, the Assyrians oftentimes depicted other people around them like they depicted themselves, even if they looked different. In other words, we can't entirely rely on how the Assyrians depict others because the Assyrians tend to homogenize their depictions of people. Also, the first image actually is not entitled as describing Israelites themselves, but rather Amorites or Canaanites, which lived in the same area. So that's not entirely accurate. I don't actually know that much about whether or not the second image is entitled as describing Israelites, but I do know that, of course, curliness is not an uncommon trait among Middle Eastern people. And in fact, there are many people who are very white who also are very curly. So the actual hairstyle doesn't really mean anything because there's a great variation of hair texture among Caucasians, as there is not as much, but still to some degree, among Negroid populations as well. This segment is a little bit misleading because it assumes that all Jews are actually Ashkenazi Jews, which is incorrect. In Israel itself, the Israeli state, there are actually more Mizrahi Jews, which is Jews from the Middle East and other parts of Asia, than there are Ashkenazi Jews. And there are also many other Jews known as Sephardi Jews who are from Iberia, and this also sometimes includes Maghrebi Jews who are also from North Africa. So, in other words, there are many different Jews that come from many different backgrounds, and the Ashkenazi are just one group of that. In fact, they are less in number inside the state of Israel than the Mizrahi Jews, to be precise. What the video is saying is correct in the sense that historically Jewishness has often been associated with Judaism. However, that still doesn't mean that descent from Abraham wasn't important to the Jews themselves. Of course, we do know that, for example, in the Bible, Ruth became a Jew by obviously following the laws of Moses and the various institution of Judaism rather than actually having to prove descent from Abraham, which as a Moabitess, Ruth certainly could have done anyway. But That's besides the point. People in the Bible can become Jews by following the laws of Moses, because the covenant isn't simply a covenant based only on blood, because God is obviously not racist, let's be honest. It is something that others can be adopted into, or as Jesus says, grafted into. And as such, many people, for example, many Egyptians left Egypt with the Israelites during the Exodus, and they eventually became considered Jews. Also, medievally, Judaism was also viewed like this as well. For example, if somebody converted to Catholicism or to something else, then they wouldn't really be considered Jews by medieval Europeans. Now, of course, we do know that there have been many Jews in Europe. For example, in southern Europe, at least, we know that from the epistles of Paul, and more specifically from the Acts of the Apostles written by Luke, in which Paul goes to many different Jewish communities that are spread out through southern Europe, because we know that they have the synagogues, and these people claim descent from Abraham, etc. And it is no stretch to say that this could have then spread farther to northern Europe, as that area became a bit more politically stable after the fall of the Roman Empire, when new big kingdoms started to arise there. Now, of course, ethnicity of the Jews, as the video says, becomes more important to the Jews well after the 11th century. And it's important to know that the 11th century is about the time when the Crusades began, and when many early crusaders decided that they would actually attack Jews inside of Europe. And the way they identified Jews was because of their religion, and if a Jew then converted to Catholicism, they were exempt. Now, of course, Jews still held an ethnic identity that was independent of their religious identity, and this is how it actually became separated, because they were persecuted to some extent, and that is how their ethnic identity became separate to their religious identity. For example, in Spain, there were Jews who were practicing Catholics, but were ethnically Jews, and they are the Sephardim, which are different from the Ashkenazi. But let's actually move on in the video, because we don't have time to discuss this all the time, of course. Well, first of all, Ashkenaz is actually not a German word. Ashkenazi is, I suppose, a German rendering of the word. Ashkenazim would be a Hebrew rendering of the word. So that's clarified. Yiddish, yes, Yiddish is a sort of Germanic Hebrew pidgin language. Biblical Israelites are not descended of Europe. They are traced back to Khazarian tribes of Russia. Okay, I have heard this before, and this goes back to the Khazars. The Khazar Empire was an empire that many believe was probably their primary religion may have been Judaism, and this is actually very probable. However, Judaism, again, religion does not, as we all know, religion and ethnicity are two different things. And also, there are many Arabs who became Judaists before Islam came around. And also in Ethiopia, this happened as well. But the question they're asking, or actually the thing that the video maker is proposing, is that these Khazars, after they were defeated went into Europe, and they were actually the ancestors of the Ashkenazim. Now, the problem with this is that, of course, the Khazars were actually defeated, and they did actually travel throughout Europe in a diaspora. However, Jews have been attested in these various parts of Europe before the Khazars were dispersed, for one. And number two, the Khazars were actually a Turkic people, and the Ashkenazim are not a Turkic people, which, of course, is a big thing that would make it look like they're not actually related, because the Ashkenazi Jews aren't actually Turkic, while the Khazars are. And look it up, as the video maker says, look it up. This is actually something that is looked up frequently, and whenever you say something like look it up, you always have to be aware that the majority view, of course, is going to be the most obvious one. And of course, the majority of scholars who study this thing would not say that the Ashkenazi Jews are descendants of the Khazars. Okay, so now let's actually move on a little bit farther.
The sons of Japheth, Gomer and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tyrus. And the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah.
Okay, here we are dealing with an actual masked man fallacy, which is a fallacy when two things look or sound the same but are actually different. Because, as we all know, things that are different are not the same. So, what the video maker is saying here is that the Ashkenazi Jews are in fact not Semitic or descendants of Shem as the actual Jews are, because they are descendants of Ashkenaz, which is a Japhethitic ethnicity. However, first of all, there's a big problem with this. First of all, this is actually pretty easy to prove wrong, because African Americans, okay, for those of you who are familiar with racial terms in the United States, African Americans, this means people of African descent who live in America, or Ashkenazi Jews, people of Jewish descent who live in Ashkenaz areas. Of course, there is admixture in the sense that, of course, Ashkenazi Jews are partially descended from actual Germans, which is to be expected if they live in an area that contains lots of Germans. However, that's not to say that they're majorly German. Also, I'm not entirely sure on whether or not Ashkenaz is actually Germany, or refers to Germans themselves. And the reason I'm saying this is because, obviously, the Table of Nations talked about nations that were in the Middle Eastern region, in the sense that there are obviously other nations or other groups of people who are not in the Middle Eastern region. Of course, Tower of Babel, they're all there at one point, but the point is that we don't actually have the ability to distinguish between many of the different groups. For example, I think it's let me go back to I'm looking at this from a picture. Okay, Magog. Magog refers to a very broad range of people, in fact. And as such, we can't say that it's really any one specific people because it refers to people descendant from a very broad range. And Ashkenaz, we don't actually have any evidence that Ashkenaz actually refers to Germans because obviously ancient Hebrews would not have been familiar with ancient Germans, and as such, they would not have been able to apply such a term to ancient Germans. Also, Ashkenaz is the name of a person and not the name of a people. Again, same thing with Mizraim. Mizraim is the name of a person, not the name of a people. Just like Cush is the name of a person, and also the name of a people that are patrilineally descended from Cush. However, that does not mean that Cush and the people Cush are exactly the same. So the point is that Ashkenazi Jews does not have to mean that they are necessarily 100% descendants of Ashkenaz. Just like African American doesn't mean that they're that the African Americans are indigenous to America. That does not mean that. And so this is something that is highly falsifiable. So the masked man fallacy, because Ashkenazi is being used to refer to Germans as well as Ashkenazi Jews, as well as ancient Ashkenaz, and all these terms are being used interchangeably while not actually being clarified as meaning something different. So let's move on. I'm actually looking forward to this. I am looking forward to the video maker explaining how the Bible justifies racism. Let's find out next time on that. Okay, so but in the meantime, please do leave comments if you have anything to say, anything to add to what I have said. Please do leave a comment. If I have made a mistake somewhere, leave a comment because I really want to fix it. I don't want to make mistakes. Besides, who actually wants to make mistakes? I don't actually know. So if you find a mistake that I have made, please tell me and I will retcon it. Okay. So also you can follow me on Twitter and Google Plus if you want to. Subscribe on YouTube. Like the video if you liked it. If you do leave a dislike, please leave a detailed comment as to what was wrong with the video. And donate on Patreon if you really want to, because, well, it really is a great help. It helps me get licensing stuff and software and stuff like that I need to make videos, and a number of other things. Okay, so I think that's all that I've got to say for now. So I will be seeing you all next time, and thank you all for watching. Anawiltus, over and out.